Well, thanks so much for being out tonight on Devil's Night, All Hallows Eve. I know that you're supposed to be out engaging in some hooliganism of one kind or another. I guess you saved that for post 7 o'clock. So thanks for fitting me in, and thank you also to the Institute for allowing me to come and do this. And to just get to talk to you about some of my weird interests and also hear back from you some questions and some ideas. So when you think about monsters, you may not automatically think about the 1950s. But if you do, they probably look a little something like this. They're coming aboard flying saucers, or they've got a lot of eyes, or they're giant bugs out in the desert. In fact, those of us who think about the 50s at all tend to have these images, even though we know better, of the 1950s as kind of a period of domestic bliss. At least domestic bliss for men, and sort of for men only. And it is entirely significant that these images, for the most part, actually come to us from and through advertising. They are selling us a commodity, and in fact, they're giving us messages in which the commodity itself is actually not even central to the message. It's so completely entangled in an ideology. I mean, this is not really about a washing machine. I mean, it is, but it's also giving you the idea that, well, patriarchal social conventions can be welded together with an image of futurity and progress, and also, please buy our washing machine. This is not simply about vitamins. This is about containing female sexuality within marriage. All of these images that were coming to us that were coming to the United States in the 50s continue to come to us. And it's fascinating that that decade is still able to speak, is still able to pass along this ideology. Now, things get a little bit, actually a lot, stranger. I'll give you just a moment to take that in. There was a Gothic side. There is a Gothic side to the American 50s, and the Gothic is a sentiment about bodies and about places and what happens to them. In fact, the Gothic is in a way about what history does to bodies and to places. And the truth is that the American 1950s are, as I think these images suggest, a far, far stranger place than any of us have imagined. In fact, their underground, sort of their dreams and fantasies, have seeped into our own. Our fascination with zombies, vampires, possessed young girls, things right at the corner of our perception that haunt us. In many respects, they have their origins here. Now, it may have seemed completely anachronistic to many of you that on the first episode of this season's American Horror Story, which is the second season that takes place within the 1950s, we had Jessica Lange dressed in full-on David Bowie clown makeup singing Life on Mars while a group of 50s sideshow performers cavorted around her on the stage. This did not seem anachronistic to me. In fact, this seemed to fit perfectly, and for two reasons. First of all, I'm clearly incredibly weird. Secondly, and more important, I just wanted to go ahead and say it. I knew you were thinking it. Secondly, and more importantly, this image, these kinds of images, actually sort of lived on a sort of cultural underside of the 1950s. Its dream life, its nightmare world. What I'm going to say to you about the 50s tonight is that it was a period in which Americans were absolutely sure that they lived in the city on a hill, And yet, at the same time, middle-class America had this sort of chill at the back of its neck, knew that something was not right, knew, in fact, that they were living in a haunted house. Mila Nurmi was a failed actor, and in her words, a failed housewife in 1954. In a time when, as she once said, repression was everywhere, she unleashed on America a character that she called Vampira, that embodied equal parts sex, death, and comedy in a way that no one had ever managed to do before. Mila as Vampira showed late-night horror films on Saturday evenings, and to audiences at first adolescent and then adults who in the local LA area, which is where her show premiered, would actually hold Vampira parties on Saturday night, staying up late to see her. There were stories of women actually calling in to the local ABC affiliate, KABC, and asking for tips on how to dress like Vampira, how to look like Vampira. Mila Nurmi created this character out of, in some ways, a whole series of underground alternative worlds in mid-century America. She borrowed everywhere from silent films to the science fiction comics that she had been obsessed with in her youth. But she also borrowed and was particularly interested in a cartoonist by the name of Charles Addams at the New Yorker. And I'm not sure if you can read the bottom there. I'll read it for you. It says, and now George Pembroke, here is the wife you haven't seen in 18 years. And then there's the wife peeking out from behind a curtain, a revolver in hand. This was not unusual for Charles Addams. He actually took these things quite a bit further in the pages of the New Yorker than you might expect for this particular era. In essence, he turned the happy home of June and Ward Cleaver into not just a haunted house, but in fact into a slaughterhouse. And if his name and if sort of this idea of kind of the alternative 50s family is sort of resonates with you, it is because he created kind of another alternative 50s family interested in the macabre. He did not give them names. He did not give the individual characters names. He just called them the homebodies. But this was, in fact, the inspiration for the 1960s TV show, The Addams Family. Although Vampira herself was in many ways also an inspiration for that show. Of course, you probably automatically thought, wow, Vampira looks a lot like Morticia Addams. But actually, Morticia Addams looked a lot like Vampira. Part of her interest in Addams was that Addams had a message that he wanted to give, and she did too. She actually thought of herself and often described herself as a sort of beat poet, doing a sort of performance art in which she had certain things that she wanted to say to American culture. And the kinds of things that she did for the show actually proved more or less beyond titillating. She did the opposite of the happy homemaker. She had a tombstone, for example, that she used as a coffee table. She joked about how she was going to make a zombie cocktail that was going to be made partially out of formaldehyde, partially out of vulture's blood, and she was going to serve it to the husband that never came home. But one of the things that made that so interesting that is on 1950s TV, the husband always at some point walked through the door. This never happens on the Vampira show. And one of the things that really struck me about her is that you often hear that Lucille Ball and Dinah Shore, these women in the early 50s, they're sort of the first women to have their own show. This is not true. They have their own show, but there's always a man that they're more or less attached to. With Vampira, this was not the case. Sometimes the sort of parody that she did became even stranger, as you can see here. She once had James Dean as a guest on her show, a pre-East of Eden, pre-fame James Dean, who showed up dressed like an errant schoolboy while she played the role of sort of dominatrix schoolteacher, rapped him on the knuckles, and told him that he had been a bad, bad boy. This actually nods to another side to her inspiration. She often spoke in interviews and gave a lot of interviews in her 80s when there started to be more interest in her, in which she talked about how some of her inspiration came from the underground world of S&M and bondage magazines in the 1940s and the 1950s, including what you see here, Bizarre magazine, as it was called, which came out of New York in kind of the mid-40s, which, believe it or not, was doing woman-friendly, female-friendly bondage in 1946, 1947, as you can see here. Vampira actually borrowed directly, even in the way that she presented herself, from these images. The stiletto heels, the cinch belt, the long nails. And you may actually have heard about Bizarre before, because it's actually the place, or at least one of the places, where Betty Page, the notorious Betty Page, gets her first forum. Well, having told you that, it's not going to surprise you at all that there were FCC warnings for Vampira's show. In fact, some of the earliest FCC warnings. The show was partially scripted, but it was really a kind of a vernacular art form. I mean, a lot of this was being ad-libbed. And so anything could happen, and it seems on some occasions anything did happen just as the camera rolled. Mila once said in an interview that she suddenly announced on the show, and I have no explanation for what she meant because she didn't explain what she meant. She just suddenly in the middle of the show said that her sister had been arrested because she had, quote, once raped a snake. Who knows what that means? Who knows where that possibly came from? Also, and I suppose it's kind of a small point, she didn't actually have a sister. But in any case, the FCC took exception to this. And so the 50s were not, in any respect, ready for her. And she disappeared, or was, as I talk about in the book, disappeared by some of the most powerful gatekeepers of fame and celebrity in an era that was really obsessed with both. But she had sat-mined a moment in American history that in some ways was actually looking for an explosion, actually wanted an explosion, was kind of repulsed but also deeply, deeply attracted to the kind of haunted body that she was trying to give them. Now, a sudden and abrupt subject change that will not make sense at first, but will later. So just stick with me. I think that James Whale understood the 1950s before the 1950s happened to us. And in fact, before the 1950s happened to him. James Whale is probably my favorite horror film director. He's not really well known today except among film and horror nerds and those of you who have been lucky enough to see the wonderful film Gods and Monsters or the wonderful novel by the same name. But he created some of the most iconic images of the 20th century. His monsters, as he called them, included Frankenstein, the Bride of Frankenstein, the Invisible Man. A gay working-class British kid, he came to Hollywood from the theater and to the theater from the trenches of the First World War. James Whale was in so many ways a sort of perfect maker of monsters. And in 1932, he made a strange and a funny and a kind of disturbing under the skin sort of film called The Old Dark House. Now, I want to keep my discussion of this spoiler-free because it's a movie that I'd like for you to watch and then actually watch again. But suffice it to say some rather disturbing things come out of the attic in the old dark house. And yet, at the same time, it sort of achieves this dark comic effect. There are horrifying things happening in this enclosed haunted house with this sort of twisted family, but it's also very, very funny. There's a sense in which James Whale and Vampira across the decades, the 1930s and the 1950s, were doing things that were actually quite similar. The 1930s and the 1950s. Vampira, the horror host who started a revolution that I believe in some ways is still going. Whale, the gay film director who created a new world of gods and monsters. How do we bring them together? And should we, in fact, even bring them together? I think that we can if we think about that idea of the old dark house, the idea of the haunted house and the bodies that have to live in them. So let's talk about the haunted house for a second. Arguably, it's actually not a phenomena that has been with us for very long. A lot of scholars would just trace it back to about the 18th century, to the 18th century Gothic, you know, Horace Walpole, Anne Radcliffe, Monk Lewis, that whole gang. These are stories that, like James Whale's story of the old dark house, are not really about the restless dead. They're actually about the restless living. They're stories in which aging aristocrats capture and try to seduce young women. There's usually a mad woman in the attic. There's a secret that's hidden away somewhere in a drawer. And all of this is happening within a physical space, amid a kind of crumbling ruin. Now, the Gothic appears, and so in a sense, the haunted house appears in the age of revolution, in the age of the American Revolution and of the early Republic. And I think it's important to note that the United States didn't want this, didn't want to be this. This is actually what's behind the whole discussion in the early 19th century of whether or not the United States can have its own national literature. We must have our own national literature, sort of thinking of Europe as kind of this senile parent, this sort of mad woman in the attic, in fact, that needed to be put away and forgotten about. The haunted houses in at the American beginning, at the American Genesis, were to be left behind. And it's actually no accident that one of the original national ghost stories, Washington Irving's Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which actually isn't really a ghost story at all, suggests that America is not a good place for haunting. Here I'm going to quote Irving. There is no encouragement, and this is actually coming from the text of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. There is no encouragement for ghosts in most of our villages, for they have scarcely had time to finish their first nap and turn themselves in their graves before their surviving friends have traveled away from neighborhoods. So when they turn out at night to walk their rounds, they have no acquaintances left to call upon. America was going to be the land without ghosts. No haunted houses for us. It was all going to be market revolutions and manifest destinies. Recently on Twitter, and I know Twitter, anyway, recently on Twitter, a Twitter mate of mine, I don't even know what you'd call that, a Twitter mate was complaining about a new phenomena among hipsters. And let me just stop to say there's nothing more hipster than complaining about hipsters. But nevertheless, his complaint was that it is apparently a thing. I don't know if this is a thing or not. It is apparently a thing now to have one's name legally changed as kind of a nod toward whatever hipsters care about. And exactly. And so, you know, this is sort of the new gearless bicycle, changing one's name. And my first response to that is, let's not call this hipster. This is as American as it gets. To borrow a phrase from another era that meant something completely different, this is 100% Americanism. The sort of idea of self-fashioning, not having a past, not wanting to be haunted by the past. And I think if there was a period in which America tried to get away from its past and get on with this project of self-fashioning, it was in fact the 1950s. Looking at America in the years after World War II, it's actually hard to believe that it would become a haunted house in the way that it did. The post-war generation, as these images suggest, would become the largest middle class in history. Commodities of all kinds were pouring out of factories that had once been set up for war work. The new interstate highway system was giving this sort of image and dream of mobility and endless possibility. Think about the convertible in the 1950s and how it became sort of more than a car. In film and advertising, it presented this idea that one could change one's identity and you could put history completely in the rear view mirror. Americans, as one scholar put it, began dreaming of themselves becoming shiny commodities without a past. Part of what I think we see happening in the 1950s is an effort to exorcise the home, to indeed keep it from being haunted, to kind of keep away that idea of the haunted house, the old dark house. It was in this era, after all, that the home stopped being a place where you simply slept, which is what it had been in the early 20th century. It stopped being, as it had been in agricultural America, the center for labor and production. Instead, during the 1950s, you had books with names like The Family Fun Book and Planning Your Home for Play that suggested, as one of these writers said, quote, the home could potentially become a clubhouse for the family unit. Now, while crafting the home as an idealized set of harmonized relationships, it's not surprising that one of the obsessions of the era was the fear of invasion, or at least internal subversion. J. Edgar Hoover was warning that the enemy could be just next door, and in fact probably was. Films like one of Liz Taylor's early films, Conspirator, essentially suggested that even the nicest man and the dream marriage could hide political depravity. Spoiler alert, in this film, her very handsome military officer husband actually turns out to be a Soviet agent. So the horror film of the era, as I mentioned at the beginning, became not the monsters of the past. Frankenstein stitched out of the dead, stitched literally out of past lives. Instead, they were little green men in flying saucers, or they were radioactive threats from the sea or the deserts, reflecting a fear of invasion or subversion. Now, we know that a turn came in American culture, and we signify this by simply saying the 60s. And we're talking about real political changes there that we are very aware of, the rise of second wave feminism, the most crucial years of the African American freedom struggle, one at least of the earliest iterations of the gay and lesbian rights movement, and a very muscular and gigantic anti-war movement. These things happened, but something else happened. A confrontation with history happened that forced a reacquaintance with the haunted house. The efforts to exorcise the house, to say goodbye to figures like Vampira, that failed. And I want to sort of begin to move toward my conclusion by talking about how it failed. Part of the story is the true cost of the Vietnam War. History, all of a sudden, in the late 1960s, became impossible to avoid anymore. The body bags kept coming home. Stories of American atrocities, slowly, but very slowly, and you should all read Nick Turse's new book about this, began to seep into American culture. And in 1973, a young history graduate student by the name of Michael Lesy wrote perhaps one of the strangest works in the history of American history, a book called Wisconsin Death Trip. This is a book that almost feels like an assault on the idea of the academic monograph. Now, in his research, and it is actually fairly traditional research in many ways, he pored over about 30,000 glass negative plate photographs, went through hundreds of spools of microfilm of newspapers from one Wisconsin county from the years 1890 to 1910. And what he came away with was an image of an American past that was completely different than anything that any child in the 50s watching the Davy Crockett show would have recognized. What he found there was a story of murder, mayhem, a public obsession with death, religious fanaticism, worries about ghosts in the houses, worries about lake monsters living in Jackson County, Wisconsin. And I think that what he was trying to do was to actually compose, he didn't actually even write the book. It's almost a kind of an artistic representation, a photographic representation, in which he tried both to peel away sort of the layers of prudery and religion that had been connected to Victorian America, but then also say something significant about America in the early 70s. To say essentially that our past, the American past, was a haunted house. I don't think that it's an accident at all that Michael Lesy's book appeared right at the same cultural movement as one of the most talked about and affecting cult films in American history, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now, part of the interest in that film was, of course, has there ever been a better name for a film than Texas Chainsaw Massacre? That combination of words alone made people want to see it. But something more was going on here, and that is that the myth of the frontier, the myth of American exceptionalism, the myth of the American past was being changed. The haunted house became the frontier homestead, and the frontier homestead was not full of ghosts, but instead full of these proletarian monsters who turned to slaughter and cannibalism in this kind of fever dream reconstruction of the frontier myth. People who had seen, teenagers who were going to see the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, had grown up with heroes dressed in buckskin killing Indians, and then all of a sudden that's transformed into Leatherface killing hippies. When asked what this film was really about, director Tobe Hooper replied, "This is about America, man. This is about America." Well, we don't expect that we're haunted in the way that people were in the 70s, right? I mean, that was the 70s, and that is long past. The truth of the matter is, I think that our own current obsessions with supernatural films, reality shows like Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, that whole sort of genre that I think of as paranormal investigation porn. That whole world is really about displacement. It's kind of the notion that we can avoid the horrors by turning them into reality TV shows. It's really Ronald Reagan calling the memory of the Vietnam War a Vietnam syndrome, as if to remember, as if to face the past, as if to face the horror is actually a kind of diseased mentality. And so we displace that onto ghost hunters. But the interesting thing is, we're still being stalked. And I think that it's particularly interesting and appropriate that we're being stalked by a Gothic Victorian nightmare by way of modern media cut and paste, a kind of collage horror of the digital revolution. Slenderman first made his appearance in a photography contest on the website Something Awful in 2009. In this contest, the idea was for photographers to edit into pre-existing photographs images of what were supposed to be supernatural entities. And one of the contributors, a guy by the name of Eric Knudsen, who used the name Victor Surge on the forum, contributed the photograph that you see here. He did something a little bit different than a lot of the other contributors. He actually added a bit of text. And all of his images are images like this. They're images that seem slightly disturbing, both because they're in black and white, both also because they are young people, and also because when you spend enough time looking at them, you see that there is a figure hovering in the background, right at the edge of what you first perceive when you look at the image. This is actually one of the more famous and one of the more disturbing of those images. And I'll point you here to the shadows. Now, after this contest on Something Awful, something sort of extraordinary begins to happen. Slenderman became what has been called fake lore, the subject of a narrative, or really a set of narratives that circulate online, or circulate primarily online, but that are given the authority of oral tradition, older folklores, and connected to various mythologies. So stories have circulated that the original photographer who took, and the story has become not that these are edited photographs, but there was a photographer who took these images, that he disappeared, that he has gone missing. And Victor Surge, Eric Knudsen, in the text that he added, actually created the germ of that story. And there have also, as many of you know, been a series of YouTube videos purporting to be sort of the found footage story of someone seeking out Slenderman. Now, something even stranger, I think, has happened with this story, because although if you go online and you look at internet forums dealing with Slenderman, you find all of these efforts to actually connect him to everything from Norse mythology to Native American mythology to early modern European myths. And yet something else has been said about him that's very strange, and this is that, well, we actually know that he was created as a meme in 2009, but what has happened subsequently is there has been so much interest in him that he has in essence become real. That the digital world actually, and these circulating stories actually created him. In other words, we have memed a monster into existence, seems to be the claim. Now, I don't believe that in any kind of literal or metaphysical or supernatural sense, But I do believe that it tells us something very interesting about the role of language and the role of what we might think of as linguistic viruses. And I believe, in fact, that Slenderman is, in a sense, the same kind of terrors that have been coming screaming at us out of the 50s over the last 40 or 50 years. The 1940s and the 1950s were also an era of an information explosion that was going to bring a war into American living rooms. It was also the era in which the urban legend was actually born. Social cautionary tales that were able to circulate by modern means not really available before. And those kinds of stories and the power of language that went with them did at that time lead to Red Scares and Lavender Scares, real world horrors created from these linguistic viruses. This is another image not connected to Victor Surge, but can show you how Slenderman, who actually sometimes is related to forest spaces, desolate places, has actually managed to sneak his way into living spaces as the myths about him continue to accumulate. Linguistic systems, including the ones that the 50s taught us in many ways to use, are still with us and still powerful. And they are able to, you might say, metastasize monsters. Something very similar happened in the last few weeks with the Ebola zombie meme. I'm not sure how many of you came across this, but a couple of weeks ago on Facebook and Twitter, this image traveled all over the place. It's actually an image that is taken from the summer film World War Z. And it has added onto it a story about an alleged victim of Ebola coming back to life in what is described simply as Africa, as if Africa is just one country. You'll actually notice here, well, you may not be able to see this, Africa confirms third Ebola victim, you know, because we don't know, it's just it's tigers and there's jungle and it's just Africa, right? Well, this Ebola zombie meme shows us the ways in which media outlets, political hacks, media outlets that are political hacks, Facebook, can essentially confabulate monsters out of racism, out of notions of disease, out of immigration anxiety over immigrants, and then take it all and combine it with our most popular monster, the infected and infecting living dead, who George Romero, I have to remind you, has been trying to say to us for 40 years now, is not the other, it is us. The monster is, in fact, us. I'll conclude with a quote from William Burroughs, who's writing really out of the 1950s, although he never wrote anything that seemed like it came from the 50s. He said in a fairly disturbing image in The Naked Lunch, as if I had to say that it was a disturbing image since it came from The Naked Lunch, that America is not a young land, he said. It's an old and evil land. And he learned this idea from the 50s, and I think his term, word virus, stands in for the power of media, advertisers, religious and political leaders' ability to deceive and confuse us, and also to give us languages of monstrosity with which we then can deceive and confuse ourselves. But perhaps subversive monster makers like Vampira, like James Whale, can show us more liberating messages, allow us to create more liberating memes that don't point us away from the dark, but but essentially force us to face them. The fact is, we might as well learn to live with the monsters. It's not morning in America. It never was, and the monsters are, in fact, here to stay. And I will conclude with another favorite and fun image from Charles Addams that is both funny and a little bit disturbing all at once. Thank you very much. I'd like to answer questions.